Alright, these are our notes for section 2-3, and it's on conditional statements. We've got a couple different vocabulary words here, and then we're going to do one example at the bottom together. Okay? So our first definition is conditional statements. And a conditional statements are sentences written in if-then form. Okay, and what that means is you would write if something happened, comma, then something else will. That's a conditional statement. And there are 4 different types of those. Okay, the first one of them is called an if-then statement, or you may hear it or read it in the directions as a conditional statement. Okay, that's just a general one. And it's just written in if-then form. It would look like if something happened, then something else should happen. Okay? An example would be if this is, let's see, if this is geometry, then Mr. Beckers is your teacher. Okay, that's a basic if-then statement. If something happened, then something else should. Okay? We'll talk about whether that's true or false here in a minute. That'll be our example at the bottom. But that's just an if-then statement. Now, the hypothesis of the if-then statement is what's after the if, but before then. Okay? So for our hypothesis, we're going to go back up to our first example. This is geometry. That's our hypothesis. Okay? Because it's what's between the if and the then. The conclusion is what's after the then part. So for our example, the conclusion would be Mr. Beckers is your teacher. Okay? Sometimes you may see them written in the wrong order. You may have the then part first. It may say, Mr. Beckers is your teacher if this is geometry. So you need to pay attention because it may not always be hypothesis first, conclusion second. They may be backwards. And we'll talk more about that in class. But know that what's between the if and the then, basically what's after the if is the hypothesis, and then the ending part, what's after the then, what should happen, is the conclusion. Now, the converse, inverse, and contrapositive, they are the other conditional statements. And they're all based off this first if-then. In the converse, you switch the hypothesis, and I totally misspelled hypothesis there, hypothesis and conclusion. They change places. And I'm going to refer to that as switch spots. Okay, that's my short hint. If I say switch spots, that means it's the converse. The inverse means that you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. And remember, negate means to add in nots to it'll be to both of those, both the hypothesis and the conclusion. And that's my, not switch spots, my shortcut is to add knots. That's my short hint. Okay, so converse, switch spots, inverse, add knots, and then the contrapositive is to switch both of them and negate both of them. Okay, so you're doing both. What you do for the converse and the inverse. You switch their places, which would be the converse, and then you negate both of them, which would be the inverse. So, my short hint is to do both. Or you may hear me say, switch spots, add knots. Put them both together. Alright, so converse, switch places. Inverse, negate them both, add knots. Contrapositive, you do both of those things. Here's our example. We're going to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive for each conditional statement. Then determine if each statement is either true or false. If it's false, we need to give a counterexample. Okay, and remember, a counterexample just shows that it's false. Something that shows that our statement doesn't work. our original statement here is if you live in Dallas, then you live in Texas. All right? And that's a true statement. Okay? Dallas is in Texas. So if I live in Dallas, then I have to live in Texas. And since it's true, I don't need to give a counterexample. Only give the counterexample if it's false. Now the converse, remember the converse, we switch places, switch spots. So it's going to become, if you live in Texas, then you live in Dallas. Okay, now we got to figure out if that's true or false. If I live in Texas, then I have to live in Dallas. Well, that's false. Okay, that's false because I could live in a different city in Texas and still live in Texas. I don't have to live specifically in Dallas to live in Texas. So my counterexample would be something like Austin. I could live in Austin, Texas, but not live in Dallas. Okay, but still be living in Texas. So Austin shows that this is false. Now you could also give me something like San Antonio. Okay, or Houston. Any of those would work as long as it's some other city in Texas that shows that I still live in Texas, but I don't necessarily live in Dallas. Next one is the inverse. Okay, so we add knots for this one. We're going to negate the original one. And it would be if you don't live in Dallas, then you don't live in Texas. Okay, so let's think about that. Let's think if it's true or false. If I don't live in Dallas, okay, so if I live somewhere out of the city limits of Dallas, then I don't live in Texas. Well, that's false again, okay, because even if I don't live in Dallas, I could live in Houston, or I could live in Austin, and I could still live in Texas. Okay, and again, Houston and Austin, just give me one of them, but they show that that's a false statement. The last one, the contrapositive. Okay, we do both. We switch the spots, and then we add knots. Okay, so it's going to become, if you don't live in Texas, then you don't live in Dallas. Okay, so let's think about that. I don't live in the state of Texas at all. Therefore, I don't live in Dallas. Well, that's a true statement. Okay, since Dallas is in Texas, if I don't live in Texas, then obviously I can't live in Dallas. That one's true. And if it's true, I don't need to give a counterexample for it. All right? That's an example where I give you a conditional statement, and you're going to have to tell me whether they're all true or false, but you also give me the converse. Again, that's switch spots. The inverse, you add knots. And the contrapositive, where you do both. All right? And those are your notes for section 2-3 on conditional statements.